Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be talking about the birth of the King in our continuing study of the Gospel according to Matthew. Matthew chapter 1, verse 18. Now the birth of Jesus was as follows. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph before they came together, she was found to be with child by the Holy Spirit. Notice this was before they were married. They were betrothed. The betrothal ceremony in Israel in that day and age was one where, we think of it as an engagement, but it was much stronger than that, where the intended bride and bridegroom would come together. This would have been arranged by their parents, and then at the appointed time, Joseph would have come to the father of Mary, would have entered into a legal agreement, and would have given her a ring. Maybe perhaps they even exchanged rings. And now they were legally married, except the marriage wasn't consummated yet. So that to break a betrothal, it was necessary. You just didn't say, I don't want to get married, I changed my mind. You would actually write out a certificate of divorce. It took a divorce to break a betrothal. I want you to see how serious this was. And the situation came about that she was found to be with child by the Holy Spirit. Now, this is the first time Matthew mentions this. He's just introducing the birth of Jesus story. And so we're not told any of the background about how she had found out about this or what the Holy Spirit was doing. That story is related to us in the Gospel of Luke. But we're not going to be looking at Luke's account. We're just going to be looking at Matthew's account. She was found to be with child by the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit had produced something in her, a child that was quite apart from any natural means. Now, virgin births don't normally happen. This was an unusual, in fact, I would say this was a once in a universe happening. And Joseph isn't expecting this sort of thing. Joseph, her husband, being a righteous man and not wanting to disgrace her, desired to put her away secretly. Now, there were one of three things that Joseph could do. First of all, he could denounce her publicly. He could say she's committed adultery. According to the old Mosaic law, that would result in death by stoning. Remember how the people had brought to Jesus a woman caught in the very act of adultery. And they were asking a question, what should we do? And Jesus answered, let him who is without sin among you cast the first stone. And so this was one of the options that Joseph had. He could denounce her publicly. He could also divorce her privately, and that was what he was intended to do. Notice, not wanting to disgrace her, he desired to put her away. That's the language of divorce. And so he's planning on doing it, but doing it in secret, where she's not put up to public disgrace. Of course, they live in Nazareth, which is really a tiny little village. Everybody knows everything about everyone, so it's not going to stay private, but still he could divorce her privately. Or, and I'm not even sure he even considered this, and yet this is going to be the third option, he could take her as his wife. And as it turns out, that's what's going to happen, but it's only going to happen after the Lord comes and instructs Joseph. So verse 20, but when he had considered this, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream. Now, this is interesting that an angel is appearing to Joseph in a dream, because remember, Joseph would have been named after an Old Testament Joseph who also had dreams. And I just think it's fascinating that there was Joseph the dreamer way back in the book of Genesis, and now here's Joseph the dreamer. And this angel appears to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for that which has been conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. Now, that's not something that people understood. They were not expecting that. That was not, people had an idea that there was coming a Messiah, and they had Old Testament prophecies of what he would be like. But being born of a virgin was not one they understood to be that kind of something that had been promised. And we'll look at the Old Testament in a minute and see why that was the case. But the angelic messenger continues, verse 21, and she will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for it is he who will save his people from their sins. Now, what I'd like to do is talk a bit about the significance of the virgin birth. What does it mean to us today that Jesus was born of a virgin? First of all, the virgin birth means that God became specific. We knew that God was concerned with man in general. After all, God is love, and he's the giver of life, and he created all life. But that's very different than saying that he loves me. That's really something else. He could have written his love in the sky and the clouds and put little words in the trees that said I love you and things like that. But instead, he became personal. He got specific. How specific did he get? Well, one teenage girl and her carpenter fiance, two regular people, and then God came near. Secondly, it means that Jesus had both the legal right as well as the prophetic right to the throne of David. We alluded to this last time when we were looking at the genealogy of Jesus, and we saw the prophecy of Jeremiah, where Jeremiah had spoken of one of the descendants of David, the descendant through whom Joseph comes, and had said, of that person, Coniah, or also known as Jeconiah, write this man down childless, a man who will not prosper in his days, for no man of his descendants will prosper sitting on the throne of David or ruling again in Judah. So the line of David had now this, can I call it a curse? This curse upon them, so that no descendant of David through Coniah would prosper upon the throne. And yet Jesus, who's going to be born of a virgin, not the physical descendant of David, or of Joseph, I'm sorry, will be a physical descendant of David, not a physical descendant of Joseph, not through that line of David, but he will be the adopted son of Joseph. And so he will have the technical, legal right, but also the spiritual and prophetic right to the throne of David. It also means that the prophets were right in what they said. You see, this is something, even though it hadn't been recognized, it was something that had been prophesied way back in the book of Isaiah chapter 7:14. But it hadn't been recognized because the prophecy itself was a bit obscure. And we're told, and it's going to be quoted right now, Matthew chapter 1, verse 22. Now all this took place that what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet might be fulfilled, saying, here it is, here's the prophecy, behold, the virgin shall be with child, and shall bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which translated means God with us. Now, as you see that part of the prophecy, it looks very straight up. It's like, well, why couldn't they see it? I mean, it says virgin will be with child, will conceive a son. They'll call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. That seems pretty cut and dried until you look at the prophecy in its context. You see, the context of Isaiah chapter 7 starts off in the first part of the chapter. It came about in the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, king of Judah. And here was Judah as in those days. And in those days, two enemies came up against Judah. We read in the rest of the verse that Rezin, king of Aram, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, went up to Jerusalem to wage war against it. Here, two other countries are teaming up on little tiny Judah, and they're out to get Judah. And God sends his prophet, he sends Isaiah, and he says, don't worry about Israel, don't worry about Aram, because I'm going to take care of those. I'm going to do away with those kings. In fact, I'm going to do away with those countries. And I will give you a sign. Ask any sign you want, as high as heaven or as low as however. And King Ahaz says, well, I don't really want to give you a sign. God says, I told you to give me one. Don't be badgering me on that. Don't be refusing. I told you to give me a sign, and so God himself will give you a sign. But remember, this is the context. Here's the sign then. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Here it is. Behold, a virgin will be with child and bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel. But notice the passage continues. He, that is this Emmanuel, he will eat curds and honey at the time he knows enough to refuse evil and choose good. For before the boy, he's going to start off as a baby, but before the boy will know enough to refuse evil and choose good, the land whose two kings you dread will be forsaken. So that there's a virgin, an unmarried woman, and she's going to be with child and bear a son. Now it doesn't say she's going to be it's going to be a virgin birth. She's a virgin now, but eventually she's going to be with child and bear a son, and his name will be Emmanuel. And before he's on solid food, before he's going to be eating curds and honey at first, before he knows enough to do good and bad. But as he gets bigger, before he's on solid food, the two kings you're worried about are going to be history. Those lands will be forsaken. You don't have to worry. Which means that the scope of this prophecy, when you look at it in context, it's speaking of something that happened way back in the days of Ahaz, 700 years before the birth of Jesus. And you say, well, wait a second. Matthew is applying that to Jesus. And that's because Matthew understands something about prophecy, that there are times when a prophecy might have a application to a very near event, and yet there's a far event, and the same prophecy, as the prophet looks, he looks and sees both events as though they are one from his perspective. They're both in the future to him. One is very close, one's very far. So that this prophecy has application both to something in the days of Ahaz, that was the initial fulfillment, but it also has this far-reaching other fulfillment pointing to the birth of Jesus. And so that means that the prophets were right in all sorts of ways. It also means that God is with us. Notice verse 23, and again he's quoting from Isaiah 7:14, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, and the L part it just means God is a Hebrew word, and Iman is with, to be with someone, and Imanu is with us. So Emmanuel, which translated means God is with us, because he doesn't expect that we understand Hebrew. He's probably writing this in Greek, but he translates it for us. And that means if God is with us, then that means that we have salvation. After all, that's what his name means. So Joseph arose from his sleep and did as the angel of the Lord commanded him, and took her as his wife, and kept her a virgin. They came under one roof, but not necessarily in one bed. And we're specifically told he kept her a virgin until she gave birth to a son, and he called his name Jesus. And that's a neat name, because the name Jesus speaks of the one who saves. Yeshua, literally Yahweh saves, and this was the way in which he brought that salvation to us.